So once you're ready to start inputting your data for your project, head on over to the Component 1 tab. First of all, you're going to want to take note on which color cell you're working in. There's a little cheat sheet here at the top in case you forget. Yellow cells are going to be a drop-down menu, so you're going to want to click on the cell and then click on the arrow to see all of your available options. Sometimes it's going to be a type of material or a description. Sometimes it could be a number. Units are also included in the drop-downs. So make sure you're selecting the right input for your project. A white cell is going to require the user to type in a data value. So that's where you're going to put in all the numbers for your project into these white cells. Blue cells are Sitewise default values. You see some of these further down here. I find that the defaults are usually pretty good, but you may have some more specific information for your project, for example, from like a manufacturer specification sheet or something like that. So you can override the default value here if you know something more specific about your project. Gray cells is just a description, so you can actually write your own information in these gray cells to help you keep track of your inputs and keep them a little bit more organized. If you have different rounds of treatment, you can label those here, or different types of wells or something like that. So you can just override that if you want to keep track of your data a little bit more. As you go through to start to populate your inputs, you'll see that there's some notes in these columns. Sometimes it describes the units in the blue cells here. So be very careful that you're making sure to enter your number here in the units that it is describing in the first column. In some cases, though, you will select your units down here from a drop-down menu. So the first major category of inputs is material production. These are things like construction materials, treatment materials, bulk material quantities, and things like that. So treatment chemicals, backfill, construction materials, that would all be entered in here. For your well materials, you can use the handy calculation sheet that is built into Sitewise to help you estimate some of the numbers that you'll be using for well construction. So you just enter your info here. It'll come out with your total amount of well materials, and then you can bring these numbers back over to the component tab and enter those here. For bulk material quantities, you'll see there's a pretty big list of options. So you can choose from there. If your material is not included, you can go ahead and enter it as material A, or very high impact material. And there's going to be another video that talks more specifically about that. So check out that video if you want to learn how to enter in materials that are not included in the drop-down menu. The next major category is transportation. There are a number of different options here: personnel, equipment, different modes of transportation for these things. For equipment, you can enter that under dedicated road load. And one thing to watch out for that is there's a limit on the tonnage. So Sitewise sets a limit at 40 tons. A typical weight that I use for transportation of a dedicated road load is usually 20 or 25 tons. One thing you want to watch out for transportation is to make sure that you're counting your mileage correctly. You don't want to double count your mileage. So here you'll want to make sure that you're going to choose your round trip distance, and for the dedicated road load, you'll want to make sure that you're going to select yes or no for accounting for an empty return trip. So if you're accounting for an empty return trip here, you'll only want to include your one-way distance. So it just takes a little practice getting used to how to enter your mileage to make sure that things are not double counted. I find that it's best to pick a way you want to do it and remain consistent for that project. The next major category is equipment use. So this will be all of your yellow iron equipment, construction equipment, drilling goes under here, electrical equipment as well. As you enter your data, you want to make sure that you are picking the right item from your drop-down menus. So, for example, you'll want to select dozer, excavator, loader, backhoe, scraper, whichever one you're going to be using. You would enter your quantity in cubic yards here. Some people just rush down to the white cells and enter their numbers, but you do need to start at the top and select the correct input from the drop-down menu before you just do the numbers. Otherwise, you'll end up with Sitewise defaults in your calculations. Note that for pump operation, it's very important to select the method. There's 3 options here. So I commonly use method 2. You have to make sure to select method 2 and then enter your data under the method 2 section. If you enter numbers here for method 2, but you leave the pump calculation method on method 1, it'll think that your operation is 0 and you'll end up undercounting. So Sitewise uses this cell to tell it where to look during your calculations. So make sure you're selecting the right pump method, otherwise your data could be skewed. Same thing for blower or compressor operations. You definitely need to select your method 1 or 2, but also the blower or the compressor or mixer. This is your type of equipment must be selected here as well. Your electricity region will be carried over from your site info tab, so you just want to make sure that it matches. If you have a state that you're doing your project in, or you can select US average, that will carry over down here to help with the emission factors for calculating from electricity use. For a diesel equipment operation, this is a category I use a lot. It gives a lot of default values here under these yellow cells, but you want to make sure to go in and first of all select your type of equipment and then go down to the corresponding equipment that you've selected and then select your horsepower. So for example, if I'm going to use a paver, I select that up here in row 265, go down to paver down here and then select the horsepower. Then Sitewise knows to use paver, horsepower, and then the number of hours that you're going to be running it for. This is also where you enter your labor hours. There's a couple different categories here. Each one is associated with a different risk factor. So this is how Sitewise calculates its safety metrics. So you can select your type of labor and your amount of hours you think they'll be on the site for. Finally, in this category, there's an option to enter your other known site activities, emissions from those, energy use, water, that kind of thing. So if you have any known emission factors or known energy use, for example, from a thermal treatment option, that's where you would enter that into this site, this cells. The next major category is residual handling. This is where you enter all of your transportation of waste from the site to the disposal facility. Again, make sure that you are taking into account your mileage here if you're going to just calculate the one-way distance or your round-trip distance if you want to account for an empty return trip. Select your fuel type here. Same with transportation above. I forgot to mention that. The default is usually gasoline, but most trucks are probably diesel, so make sure to go in and select that. You also enter here some of your treatment operations. If you have a thermal or catalytic oxidizer for vapor treatment, you would enter that in here. Landfill space, you would enter in here. Make sure to select if it's hazardous or non-hazardous from this drop-down menu. And finally, the last category is resource consumption. So if you know you're using a certain amount of water, if you know you're going to be sending water to a treatment facility, or have any topsoil brought, you can enter those values here. So as you're going through and doing your inputs, you'll notice that there are 12 inputs allowed per component. So if you have more than 12 inputs in any given category, you can always go onto the next component tab and continue entering your inputs that way. But some people like to use the components to organize their remedy into different phases. For example, component 1 can be the construction phase, component 2 can be your O&M phase, and component 3 could be decommissioning. So if that's the case and you want to get your emissions for each component individually, you'll have to combine all of your inputs to only have 12 per category. So you can do this by combining similar inputs. If you have like multiple rounds of treatment chemical injection, you can always combine them into one, or sort of combine some transportation options, whatever makes sense for your project. There's going to be another video here on development of components and generating remedial alternatives. So if you want to take it to the next step, take a look at that video, and let us know if you have any questions in the comments.